Truckers of Reddit, what spooky things did you witness on the road?
This is gonna get long. Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I was delivering and installing machines for the company I was working for. I was in a 26-foot box truck with 12 machines in the back. I was having trouble with the truck the day before, had it checked out by the rental company, and they said it was all good. Since I was behind schedule due to the truck and problems with installations, I decided to drive late to my next destination. It was about 11 o'clock at night on a state route through the Upper Peninsula. There were no streetlights, there was no other cars. The headlights from my truck were the only thing illuminating the road. I was already creeped out. At the peak of feeling like I was in the middle of nowhere, because I was in fact in the middle of nowhere, every single light on the dashboard of the truck lit up, and then it stalled. Now it's pitch black, I am stopped, and the truck isn't restarting. Rather than eat up the battery trying to turn it over, I shut everything down and started making phone calls. As I was calling everyone and anyone that would listen, I sat in the dark night, with the only light being from my hazard lights. I looked up and saw something move in front of the truck, just out of distance of the flashing lights. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I finally got a hold of someone, and they told me it would be 2 to 3 hours before they could get a mechanic to me. So now I am sitting in silence. The only noise is the clicking the hazard lights are making, and I am staring out the windshield into a void of darkness. When I see movement again, just as I was about to shit my pants, my phone rang, and that nearly secured the pants shitting because it scared the hell out of me. It was a mechanic that wanted me to get out, open the hood, and check some things out. Number, I am not getting out of the truck, with an explanation as to why. He was irritated with me, but I didn't care. So finally, after seeing the movement just out of range of the lights one more time, I threw on the headlights with the high beams. The headlights caught 3 wolves snacking on something that looked like roadkill. I honked the horn, and they looked at me like they were irritated more than scared. I was safe. The wolves more than likely weren't going to bother me, but it was spooky just knowing they were there. So I shut the lights off. I would turn the lights on occasionally to check to see if they were still there. I was basically just sitting there listening to the hazard flashers click while surfing my phone. Each time I turned the lights on, the wolves were still there. Just to remind you, I am in the middle of nowhere. No homes, no business, nothing but trees, wilderness, and wolves. I suddenly heard what I can only equate to a woman's scream of terror that sounded like it came from right behind the truck. Then something slammed into the side of the truck, hard enough to rock it. I wasn't afraid of the truck tipping over, but whatever hit it hard enough to rock the suspension enough to move me around in the cab. It was a pretty heavy truck. I turned every light that truck had on, slipped it into reverse so the reverse lights came on and laid on the horn. I was checking both mirrors, and the only thing I saw was a shadow bolt across the road. I couldn't make out what it technically was, but in my head it was werewolf, yeti, Bigfoot, lizard monster that was going to end my life, and it was going to be agonizingly painful the entire time. I also noticed the wolves were gone. From every nature documentary I've watched, the only time predators leave food is when there are bigger, badder predators around. By this time, I was in full Bobby Hill. "That's my purse, I don't know you" mode. Whatever crossed the road didn't cross very far off the road. I could hear it thrashing around in the brush, breaking sticks and what sounded to be logs. There was no noise pollution. I only had my window cracked a little bit and I could hear pretty well. I basically had the steering wheel gripped, all the lights on, and was feverishly looking out the windows and through the mirrors to make sure nothing was around the immediate area of the truck. I couldn't see off the road, and the flashlights I had were in the back of the truck in my tool bag. I'd have to get out of the truck to get to them. Finally, I saw some headlights through one of my mirrors. It seemed like it took hours for them to close the distance to me. The noise stopped as the headlights approached. It was obviously the mechanic because no one else was stupid enough to be out there besides me. The mechanic pulled out in front of me. My headlights were shining on him and his truck. As his door opened to step out, we both hear the woman screaming in terror yell again and the brush thrashing intensified. Whatever it was still close and pissed. His door immediately closed and my phone rang. He called my phone asking me what it was. He sounded more panicked than me. I had no clue what it was, and he had no clue what it was. So the mechanic called the police. He wouldn't work on my truck until we could secure the area, which I don't blame him. He didn't like my idea of him getting out of his truck just to check things out. 2 Michigan State police officers showed up. They lit that area up like it was a stadium. I finally stepped out of the truck for the first time since it all started. We heard that scream 3 more times while the mechanic was working on my truck. Thankfully, they were getting further away. The cops had no clue what it was either. They were kind of spooked too. The mechanic finally got my truck running, and I made it to my hotel for the night. The next morning, I walked the truck for inspection, and the side that was hit, there was an indentation about the size of a basketball. Whatever hit it, didn't hit it hard enough to push all the way through, but it definitely mushed the fiberglass. The indentation was about 7 feet off the ground. I have no idea what it was. I probably never will. I do confidently know that I will never ever drive through the Upper Peninsula at night again. That's the spookiest, the scariest is another long story.
I stopped driving over the road due to the lifestyle and still kept my CDL for other jobs. This was during the late 90s. I worked for a company that owned a Caterpillar D9 bulldozer. It weighed over 100,000 pounds. It wasn't common for them to move the dozer off the property, but they had the means to do it. Their means to do it was a 1980-something International tractor with a drop trailer. Both were bought specifically to move the dozer. Both had seen much better days. Both were functional and as safe as they could be. They were just used hard. The tractor had a couple few 100,000 miles on it, but that isn't odd for older tractors. We hadn't used the dozer to its full potential for a while, so the owner of the company had lent it out to one of his partners. I was basically hired to operate earth-moving equipment. My truck driving experience was just a perk. They asked me to deliver it, and I agreed. We load up the dozer, secure it to the trailer, and I was on my way. The CB antenna hadn't been tuned in forever, so I was only picking up short range with a lot of static. Weather conditions were cold, with light snowfall. Reports of ice on the road in certain areas. I slapped the oversized load banners on the dozer, and off we go. One of the intersections on the state route I was on is notoriously bad. The intersection is at the base of a hill, and if you're coming from the side, the hill is on, you don't see the stoplight or stop traffic until you get over the peak of the hill. You still usually have plenty of room to stop. As I was approaching this intersection, the CB lit up, and a guy was basically screaming into it for traffic at the peak of this hill to slow down. The problem was that my CB wasn't tuned, reception was sketchy, and I only caught about every third word. I know the intersection, so I let off the accelerator when I peaked the hill, mostly because I hated and still hate that intersection. I would have had plenty of time to stop even with the road conditions if traffic was normal. Unfortunately, traffic was not normal. There was a fresh, pretty bad accident at the intersection, and traffic had backed more than halfway up the hill. The accident had just occurred, so there were no emergency services on scene. I now had very little space to stop a very heavy load with a very old truck. I started downshifting and braking, realized I was going to be cutting it very close, and started braking harder. Then I realized I was hitting large ice patches on the road. The tires were slipping and jerking the tractor around. I heard the fifth wheel clanking, and I felt the trailer tugging on the tractor in a weird way, so I looked at my driver's side mirror and didn't see anything, including the dozer. In a panic, I whipped my head around to look out the passenger mirror, and the only thing I saw was the entire side profile of the trailer and dozer. I had made a terrible mistake in letting that trailer get out from behind me. It was one of those whelp, This is it. This is how I die. Moments. I was now jackknifing while still moving and still trying to slow the truck down while on an icy hill. I was headed for an intersection full of stopped passenger cars, and my truck weighed a lot. By this point, I was thoroughly convinced that I was about to involuntarily murder a bunch of people. I laid on the horn as much as I could, but I was also trying to work the steering wheel in an attempt to pretend I had control. Honestly, I hit a point where I basically realized I was just a passenger standing on a brake pedal. I didn't have enough room to correct anything, so I just went all out on the horn. The trailer tires finally heated up enough to start making a very loud and deep squeal. There were a bunch of people in front of me that got out and ran away from their cars. They were basically staring at out-of-control death coming down the hill. The truck finally came to a stop within 3 feet of the last car in the intersection. I could sit on my truck's bumper and easily put my feet up on the car's bumper. The truck stopped with the trailer jackknifed, so I was blocking both lanes and the breakdown lane. I was sweating and was shaking from the anxiety. As I was sitting in the now stopped truck, the people who had abandoned their cars were now screaming at me and pointing up the hill. I looked up the hill to see another tractor, but a tank trailer, basically reliving everything I just had, with much less space to work with due to my trailer blocking so much of the road. I got out of my truck and ran away from it. The second truck slid down, stopped, and parallel parked almost perfectly with my truck. Once his truck stopped, I could see he was experiencing the same thing I was. We were both extremely close to being in bad accidents. Thankfully, he was pulling a dry tank. I am pretty sure that's the only reason he was able to stop. He was running much lighter than me. By this time, the guy on the CB got through to enough truckers at the top of the hill that they basically slowed everyone down. Once the adrenaline wore off, I almost passed out. I have operated a lot of different vehicles in my life, and that situation was easily the most scary operating situation I have ever lived. I had zero control of the situation, and that's a bad feeling for an operator. I remember the people that ran away from their cars were comforting me. It's been over 20 years since that happened, and I still get the willies when I think about it. I saw enough accidents to know how that could have turned out. Had I not been able to get that truck to stop, I would have ripped through all those passenger vehicles with little resistance. Another 5 miles per hour, or being in a different lane, just a bit more ice, even the time of day would have completely changed the outcome of that situation. It would have been entirely my fault too.
TLDR stop to help a motorist with a possible flat may have prevented a murder. I service fire equipment, so I drive a box truck and cover parts of Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Maryland, and West Virginia. I was in rural Northwest Pennsylvania, returning from a service call and heading towards the interstate to go home. On the way to this customer, I saw a small pickup truck on the interstate whose right rear tire was steadily deflating. A mile or so before my exit, they pulled off to the side. I didn't stop to see if they needed help and felt a little bad about it. As I drove down this dark, twisty road, I passed a Dodge Durango pulled over into a barn driveway. There was a person lying on the ground behind it, struggling with something. It looked like the guy was trying to change a tire or get the spare out from under the Durango. Remembering the pickup from earlier, I decided to turn around and see if he needed help. I pulled into the first driveway I saw, about 1/4 mile down the road, turned around and headed back. Halfway back, the Durango passed me, going the direction I had originally been headed. I got back to where I had seen the Durango, planning to turn around again, but as I swung into the driveway, my headlights caught a figure lying motionless in the snow. I stopped and jumped out just as the figure sat up. It was a woman, maybe in her 40s, in a thin, torn black skirt and top. Her hair was mussed, her eye was starting to swell, she had red marks on her throat, and her lip was bleeding. I helped her up, got her into my truck, and cranked up the heat. I had taken my jacket off, so I gave it to her, and she covered her torso and arms. She didn't want to say anything. Her throat was sore, and she was badly frightened. I called 911, and they dispatched a police car. I gave her a bottle of water, and she whispered, "Thank you," then sat with her head bowed and eyes closed. It took about 15 minutes for the police car to get there, and she stayed silent. As the car pulled in, she said mostly to herself, "He's going to arrest me." The trooper walked up and motioned me to exit, asked her if she needed an ambulance. She declined, then asked me what had happened. I explained what I had seen. He wrote everything down, then talked to her for a few minutes. He helped her out of the truck and into his car. She quietly thanked me for coming back because she thought that guy meant to kill her. As far as I know, she wasn't arrested. She was pretty beat up, and the trooper spoke and handled her as if she were the victim of an assault. It was almost certainly a transaction, sex or drugs, that had gone badly. I never found out what had happened. I watched the news outlets for that area for a while, but never found anything.
I was driving between Melbourne and Albury very late one night on the Hume Freeway. For the non-Aussies, that stretch of the Hume is very wide, flat, and straight, so it's boring and hypnotic, especially driving alone at night. It was the middle of summer, so I was surprised to see little wisps of fog whipping through my headlight beams, but then the smell of burning plastic hit my nose, and I realized it was smoke. Up ahead, there was one other car on the road, and I could just see a tiny yellow light on the back, like a candle flame. Worried, I sped up to catch this guy, and by the time I reached him, his entire muffler was on fire. I flashed my lights and honked my horn, trying to get his attention. Just as I drew up alongside him, I saw him turn to look at me, and then a huge gout of orange flame burst out from under the car and licked across his driver's side window. Needless to say, he pulled over in a big hurry, and I pulled over about 50 meters ahead of him. I jumped out from behind the wheel and sprinted back to him to make sure he was out of the car and safe, then back to get my phone and called emergency services while running back to him. It was less than a minute since he'd pulled over, and the entire car was a fireball. I asked if he was okay, and he said yeah, but his phone and wallet were both still inside the car. I let him use my phone to make some calls and gave him all the cash in my wallet, which wasn't much at the time, and finally continued on my way once the firefighters and ambulance arrived. Let's just say I was wide awake for the rest of my drive.